Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Garry Manser. I'm Head of Data Governance with Visa Europe. I've been there for around about a year now. Prior to that, I was Head of Data Stewardship at Barclays, looking at various ways of introducing data policies. First thing I wanted to do today was actually tell you a bit about Visa Europe. Surprisingly, we do not issue a single plastic card across the planet. But if I asked you all to look in your wallets just now, you've probably got something with our logo on it. We are a membership organisation. Every single bank in the UK and across Europe owns a share of us today. And the membership model is quite an interesting one because 9 years ago, Visa itself split into two companies. Europe wanted to remain membership. The rest of the business wanted to raise money and go and start innovating in the industry. In 2 weeks' time, in a multi-billion-pound payout, we are now being taken back into that global organisation. So a big time of change for all of us. There's some big numbers there. The last time I used this slide, last year we processed a clearing and an authorisation transaction 16 billion times. This year we reckon it's going to be near to 20 billion transactions. But that's 2 transactions. Every time you put your card across, it authorises, and then we have to do the clearing transaction. That is a heck of a lot of data, and I want to share this one with you just to show you what that can actually look like. I'll talk through some of this, but I'm not going to read every slide. But we decided to look at 1 second in 1 day, and we just went like that with a calendar and then picked a time. So at 9:31:07 last August, we processed 2,182 transactions in 1 second. Different ways of doing it: online, face-to-face, over email or phone. And these are the types of things that happened. And I've spotted my own data quality mistake in this as well. But we had 10 people buy albums, 3 people decided to watch movies, can't tell you what they were, 5 people streamed music, 12 people decided to top up their mobile phone, 16 people paid the government, and we transacted in 25 different currencies. That wasn't me, by the way, before Sue checked that. One person luckily booked a holiday for £2,000, but 12 people decided they were going to fly somewhere. One of them needed to get a new passport. 9 people then booked a cruise, 15 people travelled by train, parking, petrol, and again we had 3 Italians and a Spaniard drive through motorway tolls. 15 people checked out of hotels, 2 people booked a taxi, and one of those probably was me buying the toys. This is the one I like. 8 people decided they would buy pet food at that moment in time. 5 were at the vets, and 4 were at the dentist. I'm not sure we should show that 25 people bought drugs, but it's always an interesting one. And 173 people went through a supermarket checkout. Guess Asda's the most important, popular one. 28 people bought breakfast. 6 paid the milkman. 9 went to the post office, but only 3 people decided at that moment in time to give to charity. 1 person spent over £2,000 in Harrods. Unfortunately, we never found out what they bought. Sue went shopping.
Still shopping.
Nigel went for a haircut. This one's a bit disappointing as well. Only 2 people bought flowers.
Cool.
Not quite sure what this says about the UK, but 11 of us decided we'd have a bet. And we had 24 people we had to say no to. And one person. And there's 304 other individuals that we haven't taken up in there, but it just to show you the type. I just wanted to use it as a fun example of the type of data that we have. And all that happened in just 1 second. Anyway, I'll take you back to the presentation. My presentation today is looking at my journey through data governance, the mistakes I've made, the learnings I've had, and hopefully some of it will ring true. I need to take you back to where it all began. So we are going to go back in time, quite a long way back, but unfortunately I don't have a TARDIS.
Oh, can I buy one if I do go?
You can make the noises. This is actually strange in the fact that I'm going to show you my mistakes as well. And some of them were quite embarrassing and quite scary, as Nicola and I were talking about earlier on. But we start off by going back to 2006. I had been head of analytics for a US credit card company and decided the way the organisation was looking, it was time to make a move. I'd spent a long time working for somebody who told me I should move into data quality. I should look at this, it was the next big thing, and I used to look at him and yawn. I'd spent 2 years doing a data quality role. I incentivised the telephone team to make sure they collected the right data. I was ensuring that our forms were set correctly, but I just couldn't see what this data quality thing was all about. As I say, changes in the firm meant I started to look for another role, and I then joined a high street bank in an operational risk role. And this is where my journey began. My responsibility was to look at the Basel II models that we had in place for credit risk across the corporate side of the business. Due to the role, I spent a few weeks trying to get to understand the company. I spent a few weeks trying to understand the regulation, and we had 3 books like that that was covering off what we needed to look at. I only threw them out recently, that's how sad I am. I then went to a conference in 2006 and stood in and sat and listened to Larry English, and that probably became my epiphany. That one masterclass changed the way I looked at everything. I've never made any more notes at a conference than I made that day. Pages and pages of them. I just didn't stop writing. And I returned to the office really powerful. I knew what I was going to do, and I was going to turn this bank around from a data quality point of view. So there I was. I had the regulation behind me. I also had Larry's book, and I still have Larry's book on my desk today. And because of that, I thought I was there. Anyone not know who that is? I don't. It's a band called Nirvana. I forgot this audience would be far too young to remember things from the 90s. And I thought this was it. I thought this was what it was going to be. And this is the first mistake I made and where it had all gone wrong. I went to work, I had the regulation, and it was time to go and engage with the business units. I really thought I could just go in and tell people what they needed to do. I'd spent time with our credit risk team. I understood that the models, I understood there were inputs, I understood some of them were nice to have, and we had key inputs as well. It was clear reporting was required. It was clear there was no control at that time over those inputs. We also wanted to do more than the regulation required. We didn't want to just do accuracy. Going back to one of the slides earlier on, we wanted to look at the validity of the data. We wanted to look at the completeness of the data. What's the point of having an input to a model if you're not going to actually bother to put the information in? So we started to build those controls and started to build those rules. To get those business rules, though, I had to engage with the experts in the business. Each model had its own model committee. And I took a spot at the meeting of everyone over the coming weeks. Most of them were really, really nice. I got to explain my role, I got to explain the task ahead, and I got to explain what we needed from them. But this was also my first mistake, because everything I was talking about was a take. They had to give me something, and I had to then go and do a job. I wasn't actually asking, I wasn't showing them what it meant to them, I wasn't giving them anything back. It was they were doing something that was mine. It was very much operational risk saying, just do what we say. And most of the model committees surprisingly happily did that. As I say, I did say most, so I would turn up at these meetings. This was my first real comeuppance. These model committees were led by senior directors in the organisation. They were accountable for everything that happened under that piece of work. They each reported into the head of corporate, who then reported into the board. In one meeting, one of these directors asked me why they should do this. And I sat there proud as punch and said, because the regulator says so. And that was it. That was my one moment. It was all I had. I was facing a room of senior people in the organisation, and this MD didn't believe me. And to say he was a little bit upset is going not too far. I went through a couple more of, no, tell me why I need to do this, and I just floundered. At this point, I was told to leave the room. Actually, I wasn't asked to leave the room. I wasn't told to leave the room. I cannot repeat, because there's far too many ladies in the room, what words were used to me to get out of his meeting room. This was the worst bit, because I'd arrived early for this meeting. I was full of everything, and I took the seat right at the back and had the walk of shame past every single one of these directors with those two words ringing in my ears. Destroyed everything. My nirvana was shattered, and I just didn't know where I was going to go. I tried, and I tried, and I tried to get back in front of this director over the coming weeks, and every single time he just shut the door. This was my first mistake. I tried to put quality before governance, and then I tried to just rely on the regulation. We all look at these regulations even today. I know it's been spoken about here. I was somewhere else this morning when we were talking about GDPR. We've gone through various Bauer rules. We've gone through Solvency II in industry. I just tried to do it based on regulation, and it just wasn't going to work. Nigel, I apologise for this slide, but it is the only one with bullet points in.
You're allowed.
I persevered though. Over the next 18 months, we defined and tested over 300 business rules and managed to deliver them over most of the models. It worked between the credit risk team and the model teams, and we actually started to get ownership. We even started to get competition. One model team wanted to be better than the next. We implemented the data quality solution. We did it in-house. We used SaaS. We didn't buy a tool at the time, but we actually implemented quite a good solution. And then we decided we'd produce a monthly report. And our director at that time decided this monthly report had to be 40 pages. We had 40 pages of 38 pages of text and 2 charts. We presented it to the RWA Management Committee, and they sent it back with, we haven't got time to look at this. My team got hold of it, and the following month we sent back 2 pages. And the only reason we sent back 2 pages was 11 models on 1 page, just you couldn't read it. This then became a regular spot at that meeting. As our rules matured, we started to look at the reasons why they were happening, and go back to what I was talking about before. We were able to start looking at the controls that were in place over each of those data issues. We defined thresholds as well, so the organisation could only be 5% effective in any one of its models. Each model committee then had reporting on the agenda, and I used to get to go along to all of them. The best one, I then got invited back to the meeting that I failed at 18 months previously, and he actually became the biggest supporter of what we were doing across the organisation. I didn't realise it, because I was only interested in data quality, but we now got to the point where we were doing data governance in the organisation. We had a corporate board, we had model committees, we had data owners. We'd achieved governance on that one piece of data, and we didn't even know it at the time. We then started to look at the front-end controls that I mentioned up there, and we started to look at why we were collecting the data badly. We put in preventative rules, we put in detective rules, and we actually held people accountable. One of the ways we did it was, rather than spend thousands of pounds changing our credit model tool, we put a web page over the top which collected data, validated the data, and then fed it through to the model page. If the data didn't meet a detective rule, then you had to give a reason why you were putting that data in. So, for example, taxation we would expect to be 10% of turnover. If it was bigger or lower than that, you had to give a reason. Some clever spark in our organisation worked out that he could put anything in that box. And for the next 2 months, all I got was Hearts FC are better than Hibs FC. And that was his reason for every single one. Anyone from Scotland here will understand that, but that was what he put. What was good was I was able to take that to the model committee and watch as the head of that committee took this person to pieces and asked him what he thought he was doing, why he wasn't doing his job, and in which envelope did he want his P45, because that's how serious the organisation had taken it. He didn't go, he got demoted, but that's how it worked at that time. We'd actually got people that interested in what we were trying to do. And then the credit crunch happened. Well, credit crunch, whatever you want to call it. We were taken over, and actually my role was starting to change. So what we then started to look at was we were looking at migrating multiple amounts of data between two organisations, and one of our model committees decided he would be Top Gun and he would deliver his migration over a weekend. So he got all his team in, they closed down all the accounts on one system, they opened them up on the other, completely manual, and the bank's RWA doubled overnight. And we realised then there was an issue, and all of a sudden my team was called in. We started to look at principles over data migration. Sounds silly, but we had things like you must close off one system if you're opening up another. We didn't, we left that system open. We had checks and balances over the data that was being moved. We actually got people to sign off to say they were accountable for them as well. If you couldn't meet these principles, you had to go to a credit risk board and you had to get a waiver. They became part of the project process, and actually we stopped a number of quite bad migrations happening. Ironically, later on, I actually went back and delivered a migration that I'd stopped, and did walk into a meeting room with somebody saying, what are you doing here? And isn't it ironic you're now going to deliver this? But that was what we tried to do. We managed to get the project managers in the business on board as well. They understood we were there to make their job easier. They understood what we were trying to do, and actually they would get there to the point they were supporting us. The role was always going to be limited. We only had a finite amount of data to migrate, but we stopped the car crashes happening in the organisation. After that, it was time for me to move on, and this time I decided to move into the world of consultancy. It was a change of industry as well. I went into a banking team and got told I was doing insurance. I was also told there's a piece of regulation coming in called Solvency II. Read it. We've just sold you as our Solvency II expert to the rest of the organisation. So again, it was great. But again, I had a framework, not much different to what I had before. And surprisingly, I still had Larry's book. And again, I went out into the business. This time though, I was hoping we would get compliance. The thing about Solvency II and the thing about what we were looking at is it wasn't just insurance companies that were involved. For those of you who don't know, a lot of insurance companies will take the data, especially their pricing data, from asset management and asset servicing companies. And we started our journey with those. As one of the big four, we were going out and saying to the asset servicers, you've got to have good data, otherwise somebody's not going to buy it. I went to two different organisations at the same time that were on the same street in a very famous part of London, and I'm not going to tell you who they are. We worked with both of them looking at their Solvency II compliance and looking at their data and looking at their data quality. One of the things we were looking at doing was getting data ownership across the business. It was very different across those two organisations. I sat in the first one where we started talking about this, and the head of the model at the time went, you, and you are data owners. Go do it. No discussion, no idea what they needed to do, just go and do it. It was awful, and it was one of those where actually, as an organisation, we wanted to walk out of the room. It was never going to work, and it was never going to happen. We were still there 18 months later trying to fix their issues for them. That was probably the time when I learned that data governance wasn't about the policy, it wasn't about the process, it was about the person. The other organisation sat down with its people and talked to them. We interviewed everybody in the data chain and identified through them who the data owner for a particular piece of data was. It was actually an easy job for me because they identified themselves. But it was that time that I realised you can have world-class policies, you can have world-class data governance or data quality software, but we needed the people to buy in. Theirs was the most successful, and they were able to take it to market a heck of a lot quicker. What I found in that, though, was the support of senior management in the implementation of data governance, as in the previous presentation, is the most important. We needed the voice from the top to come in and say, this is how we can do it, this is why we're doing it, this is what we want you to do. It had to be a positive message. It wasn't just the Nike just do it situation. The other thing I learned about data governance at that point was your skills are transferable as well. Led me to probably my most surreal experience. I'd worked in financial services, I'd done insurance, I'd done asset management, I'd done banking. I got sent to a mine to talk about data governance. But it wasn't a mine in the UK, it was here, for those people just above. It was 2 hours outside of Seville. And I was to deliver data governance to a group of miners. I knew I was in for a different situation when I got picked up from the airport and the driver told me to get out of my suit and put on a pair of jeans. He then handed me a high-vis jacket and a hard hat. And no, I don't have that picture suit. Now, even worse than that, my Spanish is really limited. I can order a meal, I can definitely order a beer, but that's about as far as I go. We've had every single conversation at this point in English until we turned up at the mine. This presentation was to the miners themselves. We sat in their meeting room and they all trooped in their heavy boots, their hard hats and their jackets, men and women alike, and some of them looked really scary. The head of the organisation, again, it's a different type of business, used some rather strong language when he was talking about garbage in and garbage out, but his team understood it and they understood where they wanted to go. We spent the next 4 hours discussing data governance, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English, and mainly by drawing pictures. Really good fun, we went through 2 of those. It's an experience I never forgot, because now I find myself drawing pictures more than I ever do talking words or presenting slides like this. My time with consultancy, as you can see, then broadened my experience, sharpened my skills, and I hope I added to the success of every program that I worked on. I've worked across organisations that defined process, defined policy, or defined people. As I said, my belief is governance always starts with the people. The people at the top of the organisation leading where we're going, or the people that are actually going to deliver it. I always look to identify the right people in the organisation as well, and anyone that saw my presentation a couple of years ago, I actually give them names and look for, so for example, you'll have Mr. Been There, Done That. And that's the person I always look for. I want to find the person that's got the war story that will tell me why 5 times in the organisation this hasn't worked. Because he's the person that's going to tell me why it will work and what I need to do to get it right. It's the way I look at it. Could talk about all of them, but we don't have time, and I know you've all got drinks waiting. But that's what I've looked at. My biggest successes have been where people are engaged, either through the guys that identified themselves as the data owner, or the new start that actually wants to be part of the business. I started with process-led data quality, and I found that that was successful, but I still needed the people factor. Processes took me so far, and then the challenges became too much. I needed that all-important buy-in across the organisation, as we heard again in the presentation before. But I also need to talk about the ugly. Using a data policy to deliver data governance to me is disastrous. I've seen two examples of this. I'm happy to be challenged here, and I know Nicola will afterwards, but my data policies that I've written are 20 to 25 pages, depending on the organisation, and I'll base them around core principles. I've worked with two companies. One decided that my policy could be no bigger than 7 pages. It had to fit to a structure, and I couldn't have any more. No, 7 pages with Arial 6 works, but it just didn't work in that organisation, and I know that organisation still struggles today. I went to a second one who rejected my 25-page data policy because their policy for policies were policies had to be 100 pages. And if they weren't 100 pages, they weren't policies. Is there anyone in the room that can put their hand up and say they've read a 100-page data policy apart from me?
What's the principle that drives that policy?
I have no idea. But they gave us examples of their policies, and I've never put so many pictures and so many charts and so many explanations in a policy as I did that day. I must have repeated the same thing 7 times to get to their 100 pages. Nobody in the business read it. Nobody in the business was interested in it. It was literally, that was their policy for policies. I'm sure it pops up at desk somewhere these days just because somebody's got a wobbly leg. I've also sat in meetings where policy's been discussed, and it's got to the point that somebody has put their head on the desk and asked for someone to put a sensible hat on. That's probably the role we play, is putting a sensible hat on. But if you get to that point, it's time to close the meeting and have those conversations outside. I've learned it's very easy sometimes to hide behind something, but having been told to go away from a meeting, it doesn't work, and it helps to keep it simple. And now I'm in another journey. I joined an organisation in Visa as head of data governance, and found out governance in Visa meant something different than it meant in Barclays before. We don't own our data, so I've got a different journey to go. Some of that is around security, some of that is around data protection, whatever you want to look at. But it's an interesting journey, and I still continue to learn. I still call out to people like Nigel, to Sue, to Dara, people like that, and I'll phone them up and say, can you help me? Because that's what we should do as a community. To me, I've worked for CDOs, I've worked for a good CDO, I've worked for a really bad CDO. I don't think the CDO defines the organisation, I think the people do, and we need to work with our people to make sure that happens. And at that point, I will stop, because I do then start to just preach to you. Does anyone have any questions? Not you.
Just ask us, you hit upon your beginning when you've not heard of data quality, or what you were so familiar with data quality, but it's just more of a comment. We've got a piece of legislation called the Data Protection Act, which has quality in it, as well as security, records management, all that kind of area. But I'm always surprised when I come across an organisation that never heard of it. So
It was,
yeah.
in the organisation I did, this was 2005, 2000. Well, the first organisation I was there in 2000, and yeah, we had requirements around that, but a lot of what we were doing internally was reporting on the state of a credit card at an aggregated level, so we weren't down to that individual status. So we would report 50,000 cards at 1 month down on their payments and roll those pieces of data through. I built an excellent script in various different tools, but never actually thought, was it doing the right thing? So that's where my view of quality came from. It was looking at, if we had people phone up, the example I gave around the telephone engineers, these people had 8 minutes to take a credit card application. And in 8 minutes, That was all they did. They weren't worried about were they typing it in correctly. They weren't worried about were they asking the right questions. They just had 8 minutes. And if they didn't meet their target, they didn't get paid. And it was trying to turn some of that around and say, we need to think about this. So I agree, but it was still an early subject.
It's been around for a long time, team records, all the stuff that governs. And it's a big, I know it's a big piece of legislation, but hardly anybody, especially in IT, and still come across it, let alone the GDPR, which is even heavier now.
It's interesting. The one second presentation I showed you, unfortunately I couldn't get the video to work because you don't have me talking and there's a nice bit of music and everything else. But it took us nearly 6 months to get that agreed, and that's on aggregated data, because there's no way of identifying. You can't go and identify the one person in China that spent £2,000 that day. But we still had to make sure that we could present what we wanted to present. The fact I named Sue for buying 8 pairs of shoes is a strong name.
Do you know who bought Belgium?
Actually, I probably do relate to that.
I didn't notice that as I spoke with the slides before.
So I was just thinking, in the benefits of time, as we're overrunning very slightly, we can't plan to have panel debate at this point. I think what we're going to do now is just an open Q&A session. Before we do that, I just want to join me in thanking Garry. That was really